The Battle of Chancellorsville erupted on April 30th, 1863. Um, it was, by any measure, a resounding Confederate victory. And it's often called Lee's masterpiece, and with good reason. Lee's only awfully lucky, but that doesn't mean it's not a masterpiece. Um, the fellow he was fighting against was a general by the name of Fighting Joe Hooker. Hooker was a man who he was a good general. He didn't get the name Fighting Joe, or the name Fighting Joe didn't stick by accident. He really was a good general. Like booze, like women, lots, but he had real skill. And as he will show later in the war, in late 1863, he's going to be able to handle troops quite well. That's not going to happen here, but that's essentially what's going on. Of course, Fighting Joe, kind of a dashing kind of guy, and the opening movements. What had happened was Lee was at Fredericksburg still. He had Battle of Fredericksburg back on December 13th, 1862. But Lee had to send Longstreet and Longstreet's men, that's the First Corps of the Confederate Army, a way to deal with the problem in North Carolina. Now, Lee is left with about 45,000 soldiers. Hooker has somewhere around 100,000, 90,000 to 105 might be a figure. And Hooker had this plan. He would use his cavalry to threaten Richmond. Then he would have a fellow by the name of Sedgwick, General Sedgwick, threaten Fredericksburg. And meanwhile, the main body of the Northern Army would be slipping upstream up the Rappahannock to go around Lee, to go around Lee's western flank. It was an attempt to get around Lee and force him to fight in the open field. For some reason, when Hooker met some resistance inside what's called the wilderness, which is a section of trees and brush, awful stuff to get through. For some reason, when Hooker did hit some Confederates, he pulled back to a place called Chancellorsville. Now he's got a huge army, certainly at least twice as big as anything the Confederates can put against him. But yet he pulls back out of the woods and into a clearing called Chancellorsville. Robert E. Lee's cavalry commander, James Earl Brown Stewart, Jeb, discovered that Hooker's flank was quote unquote in the air. It rested on nothing there. It had no natural protection to the west, and therefore it was the western flank, so it could be attacked from the west. It was the western of the army, so it could be attacked from the west. And there'd be nothing to stop it. So as a result, Lee and Jackson decide that, despite the fact that Lee has many fewer soldiers than Hooker does, Lee decides that Jackson will go around and attack that western end of Hooker's army. And of course, we don't know, this picture, this is fairly famous. It's the last meeting of Lee and Jackson. And this actually happened. We don't know what was said between the two of them, but clearly, Lee and Jackson had cooked up a plan to discombobulate and hopefully destroy Hooker's army. On May 2nd, Jackson took 30,000 troops, leaving Lee with about 15,000. Again, I warn you about numbers. They're nice things to have around. All day long, as Jackson marched around with 2/3 of the army, marched around Hooker, Lee kept attacking Hooker, faked him out and all that stuff, kept Hooker's attention on him. And then about 5:30 in the afternoon, Jackson completed his march around Hooker and formed his troops into two long lines, a mile long, of attackers. And at 5:30 p.m., Jackson hit Hooker's flank and simply vaporized it, for want of a better term. It just wasn't there anymore. That night, Jackson, probably seeking to find a way to finish the Union Army off, most likely looking for a way around the Union Army behind it, so that he could essentially hold a river, the Rappahannock, against Hooker. Jackson, about a little bit after 9 p.m., gets shot. Some of his own soldiers thought he was coming in. Everybody was a little jumpy, and now here comes these people on horseback, and so the soldiers fired. Jackson was hit 3 times, had one of his arms amputated, his left arm amputated, and so on May 3rd, Lee has to return to the battle without Jackson. Jackson's alive, but Lee and Jeb Stuart essentially linked Lee's army back together. There's awful bloody fighting on May 3rd, both at Fredericksburg and at a place called Salem's Church. General Sedgwick breaks through at Fredericksburg, pushes the Confederate force there to one side, and descends upon Lee from the east. Lee turns, basically ignores Hooker, and attacks Sedgwick, pushing him back. And then again, we're doing all this with fewer troops, and then turns back to getting rid of Mr. Hooker. One of the footnotes here is May 3rd is the second bloodiest day in the Western Hemisphere. That's never remembered, but this is tremendously savage fighting. And Hooker basically gives up. Should he have? I think the answer is clear. No, he still had many, many, many more troops than Lee did, but nevertheless, give up he did. Jackson is taken. Hooker retreats across the river, thoroughly beaten. If his army hadn't been thoroughly beaten, he was certainly thoroughly beaten. Jackson is taken down to a cottage a few miles away from Chancellorsville. It looks like he's going to get better. But then pneumonia sets in. In those days, pneumonia was a death sentence. And they sent for Mrs. Jackson, and Stonewall saw her come in. She came in on a Sunday, and she said, and he said, to looking at his anxious wife, he says, "Don't worry, Al, there's nothing to fear." And Jackson's wife attempts to tell him that he's dying and that he has no hope. And finally, the doctor comes in and says something to Jackson like, "Today, General, you have to be prepared to be with the Lord." And Jackson responds, it's a Sunday, Jackson responds, "I've always wished to be translated on a Sunday, to die and Sunday to go to heaven." Jackson mind wanders through the afternoon. He gets sicker. About mid-afternoon, he was kind of in a coma, and suddenly he wakes up and says, "Let us cross over the river and rest in the shade of the trees." And dies. A brilliant battle by General Lee. I don't suppose any other general, maybe not even Jackson himself, would have sent 2/3 of his army around Hooker's flank. The fighting, once it got down to just slugging it out, was in the Union favor, and the Confederates were going to lose a lot of troops. That's one of the prices of having Robert E. Lee. At the end of the day, it's not that Lee won this battle. With reason it's called Lee's masterpiece. It was certainly a masterpiece of daring and skill. It wasn't so much that Lee won this battle, it's that Hooker lost it. And old Joe Hooker later on asked, what happened? And he says, to tell the truth, I just lost faith in old Joe Hooker. But the most important thing is the death of Jackson. Without Jackson, Lee will never win another battle on the offensive. And that, of course, will change how the war is fought. And anyway, the death of 1,000 men is a statistic. The death of one man is an event. Take care. Stay well.